So, everybody doing good? Having a good show? Yeah. Good time? Okay. Let me kind of explain what we're doing here. I'm going to turn this other monitor off. I thought that would go away. That's not at all distracting when you're trying to start your session. Okay. So, what we're doing this session is build on the agenda as a co-presentation. I guess I put my name up here, but it really is two people are doing this. What Ben, Rob, and I did, Ben is right back there. Ben and I have come up with like kind of a scenario, and the scenario's got three main components to it. I'll explain what it is in a second. We've taken the two sessions and we basically said, okay, I'm going to do one component. Ben's going to do another component. The other one, the component in the middle is tiny. It's a service that runs in Azure, so it's no big deal. Just a simple database that's got a WCF service, OData service that we can read and write to and stuff. But we don't have the internet working so much that well in this room, but don't worry. My stuff will be just fine getting around all that stuff, okay? So I'm going to do the first piece. And I'll explain what we did in just a moment here. So it's mine. I know you've probably seen me say this on Twitter, or maybe heard some other people. My session is all going to be about doing a SharePoint hosted app, but doing it in this technique called a single page app. All right. So I'll get into that in just a second. First, my name is Andrew Connell. I'm a MVP for SharePoint Server. I've got a SharePoint focused blog. There's my email address. I'm on Twitter. Also do training, hands-on training through Critical Path training, and then also have a bunch of recorded classes and more to come on Pluralsight. I'll leave this slide up for just a few seconds here. So if you want to write this URL down, the entire demo that I'm going to do, all the code, the slide deck and everything, they're all available at that URL right now. You can go grab them right now if you want. So it's just a short version of my name, acon.me, and then SPEvo13- and then the session code. Okay, that's all it is. That's got everything in it. It's got the service, the service and the database piece using the entity first, any framework code first migration stuff to build the database, and the WCF service that runs in Azure. And then it's also got the entire app that we're going to look at in a minute. Encourage you also to join in on a conversation on Twitter if you can get out onto Twitter. I'd love to see any kind of feedback you have from this. This is the first time I've done one of these kind of apps. I really like it. And I would love to see what you think, and if you have any other questions that you don't ask during the session, feel free to post them on Twitter. I'll be happy to take a look at them and get back to you. So I got just a really brief slide deck that we're going to go through. We've got just a few things we're going to cover. I guess I should ask you first, what are you interested in? I did this yesterday. How many of you were in my workflow session? Okay, these demos work. Today, yeah, and yesterday, you'll love it. I got back to the hotel, I rebooted shut the entire farm down and rebooted it, brought it all back up, and all of them deployed just fine. Under the covers, service bus had gotten wrapped around the axle and with IP settings and stuff, and I run a 5-server farm, a domain controller exchange, SharePoint, SQL, and Office web app. So all of that just got all confused and stuff, and so just a reboot cleaned it up and disconnecting from the internet. But I did the same slide yesterday, and this is even going to be more true today. How many of you are interested in lots of slides and just a little bit of code? All right, sure, the business user guys, right? All the guys that I usually see drinking out, so I know they're just messing with me. Or would you rather see just a few slides and loads of demo, right? Okay, that's good, because if you answered the other way, I would be a little screwed, because I don't have a whole lot of stuff here, okay? So I was going to say it's a choose your own adventure, but I've chosen for you. You've chosen wisely. So what is the solution that Ben and I came up with? Well, what we did is we came up with this thing called a learning management solution. And it's really simple. You've got learning paths, and learning paths contain learning items. For instance, a learning path, I want to learn SharePoint 2013. Learning items, go read this blog post. Go read that blog post. Go read this article. Go watch this course. Go do this hands-on lab. Go buy this book, right? So I got 2 books to give away, and anybody that's looking, I'll give them to like some of the best questions or stuff. If you got questions during the session, please feel free to raise your hand, ask them. If I'm starting to run short or something, or I think I'm going to be pressed on time, I might punt them to the very end, and we might do questions at the very end. Not sessions at the very end, that's not how it goes. So the idea is that we have the learning management stuff is all going to live inside of a public service inside of Azure, where anybody can go use this stuff with different clients and stuff. What Ben's going to show you is how to consume the data from Azure, talking back to SharePoint as well, using things like a Windows 8 client, all right, and some other things. Okay, so I'm going to let Ben talk about that piece. My piece is going to be the management piece of getting those learning paths up into the learning management system. And the way I've done it is with a SharePoint hosted app implemented as something called a single page app. A lot of the stuff that under the covers, some of the other things that this app does is this app also will allow me to build these things as an unpublished state, and then I will publish them, that I will have a workflow that will actually package up the items and submit them back over to SharePoint using no server-side code, and I'm not doing anything with the SharePoint user interface except for just the little blue bar at the very top, right? We're not going to use any of that stuff. It's all going to be done through REST and CSOM and some external libraries. Now, what is a single-page app? How many of you have heard the term or are familiar with the term single-page app, right? Okay, so what this is, you think of something like Gmail. Think of the Office web app, Outlook web application, OA, for getting your email or something. Or there's a service out called Trello that is about task management. The idea is that you load your application. The whole thing runs in a single file, right? It's all hosted from a single file, I should say. And then you're going to use this application, this shell, to change the UI, manage everything, and maintain the entire life cycle. So you don't ever navigate away from the page that you're on. The URL may look like it changes, right? Similar to how, like in SharePoint 2013, we have that start page and then the hash after it, and it does that minimal download strategy with the rest of the URLs. Something similar to that, right? And it's going to be done using all client-side script, all using JavaScript and everything. It is really good. It's really well suited for a SharePoint hosted application to where I don't have to worry about building multiple pages. I really like this. This is the first one that I've built. And honestly, what you're going to see, this is surprising to me. This is the result of about 25 hours of building this. And some of that is also a bunch of churn of trying to figure out, like, I don't like this image, I don't like that image, or something like that. I don't like the way it's being presented. Okay? So there are actually no images. When you see it, there's no images at all in this. It's all CSS and HTML. Some of the aspects of a single-page application, though, are things like it takes over the navigation in the browser. So if you use the backspace button to go back, or if you use the forward and back button in the browser, you're not navigating away from the page. I've hijacked those buttons from the browser, and I'll even show you that I've got a history and everything pulled up. Okay? A lot of this is all done, though, using some external libraries to make your life a lot easier. There is a lot of script, and I know some of you are probably going to get a little queasy about the amount of script at first, but it's really not that bad. And in fact, there's some optimization stuff that you can do to minimize all of this stuff. Okay? So what different libraries am I using here? I'm just going to touch on a handful of these. Some of them are more important than others, and we'll see what to get into it. So first, Modernizer, very common. Most of these are very common, and some of you probably know about all of these. Modernizer is just something that allows you to do cross-browser detection and also gracefully fail if you don't have a browser that supports certain things. jQuery, if you're still under the rock and you don't know what this is, jQuery is basically a library that if you're not using it, you're insane if you're doing JavaScript and working with the DOM. It just makes your life, get out of the way of the slides, see people taking pictures. Remember, you can download this right now. The slide, that slide's in there. jQuery is just for selection of things on the DOM. It's the big piece it's giving me. It's also, I'm using it for AJAX calls as well. Knockout is a library that lets you implement the model view model view model pattern in JavaScript and HTML. And effectively what it does is very similar to the MVVM pattern that we have in the XAML languages. But basically what it does is I don't mess with the UI. I kind of tell the UI in an expressive sense of what I want it to look like. I use these data binding tricks inside the UI to say this is where the title is going to go and this is where the description goes, and it's bound to the currently selected item. And then I have a thing called a view model, which is just a big object, a big class. And as I change properties in there, Knockout is watching those properties change and is updating the UI on my behalf. Or it's updating a collection of items in a list on my behalf as I add items to the list. I'm not writing HTML and JavaScript, right? You might like to do that. I don't like to do that, right? I barely like JavaScript enough to be able to go that far. Right? Also, I'm using this thing called Durandal. Durandal is it's relatively new, but what it does is it provides a lot of stuff that you're going to want in a SPA framework that I'll show you. For example, things like being able to have like a core routing kind of a framework. So if you went to my page and went /learning path or learning items, it will look to the end user like I'm navigating to a different page, but it knows which views you're looking at and loads the views for me. It's also going to provide some core logging functionality and stuff. We'll see that when we get into it. These three over here, jQuery, Knockout, and Durandal, are by far the most important ones. They're the biggest ones that are in this application. There's another thing called Bootstrap, or you might hear it as Twitter Bootstrap. It's going to allow me to do some nice UI stuff. I'm not a good UI person, but it allows me to allows me to implement the UI fairly quickly with CSS and stuff, so tabbed interface and all that. Font Awesome is a library that's going to allow me to look like I have images in this application, but it's all CSS, right? Including the thing that's going to look like an animated GIF. It's not a GIF at all. It's actually just CSS and JavaScript. Link.js, I don't have to explain what that is other than just pure awesome, right? So that thing is going to allow me to use link queries inside of my application. I'm only using one, but in this case. And then Toaster, you'll see, just gives me little notifications, like SharePoint's got little notifications, all right? Now, before I start this, a couple things I just want to touch on real quick, all right? As you see, and then we'll just jump right into the demo, and the session's over. So we're done with slides. Right? It's the other company car. So I have this, couple things I want to start out with this. So let's go, where'd it go? There it is. Okay. So there's a couple things that you might be, let's take a step back here. We're doing JavaScript development. Microsoft has obviously said, and really you can distill it to, in SharePoint 2013, hey, developers, get out of SharePoint, okay? You're either doing your development in the client or you're doing your development in some sort of an external application. It's funny, you kind of have these conversations with customers and they're like, what are the different options? You say, well, SharePoint hosted. What's SharePoint hosted? That's doing everything with JavaScript. Okay, well, you gotta do all the client-side stuff and developers get a little queasy. Some people are very, against JavaScript, right? Some people in the room. I'm not asking you to wave your hand. I'm raising my hand. I hate it. I hated it crazy. But the other thing you have the option of is doing what's called cloud apps, which boil down to provider-hosted and auto-hosted. Yesterday in Chris O'Brien's session, he went through this conversation that he thinks customers are going to have, or will have with customers about, oh, we don't want to do the SharePoint hosted one because that's all JavaScript. Let's look at the cloud hosted ones. And you look at all those, you kind of get all the way through, and you're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And the very end goes, what was wrong with SharePoint hosted again? And it's funny because I'm sitting here watching him start this. I'm like, I wonder what his experience, what he's thinking here. I've had that exact conversation now with 3 customers that has gone the exact same way. So it was really funny to see that. I wanted to just stand up and be like, that is happening. You think it's happening, it is happening. So I really recommend you go check out his slide deck. Another thing too is that I think the development process for doing something like this SharePoint hosted app is really slick. It's really nice. Because one of the things that I can do here is that I can hit F5 in my application, and as I make change after it's deployed in my SharePoint hosted app, I can leave it deployed the whole time with Visual Studio Debugger still running, so it's attached to the process. As I make changes to my CSS, my HTML, and my JavaScript, the dev tools for the SharePoint dev tools will detect those changes and will automatically upload them during the debugging process. So I've literally sat in debugging mode, hit F5 one time over a span of about 3 or 4 hours, and just kept building and working on the app. The only time you ever have to drop out of it is when you add something to the project, like a JavaScript file or a CSS file or something like that, or add an HTML fragment. It's really nice, it's really good for rad development, and it also gets around that whole installing app. Second 1, second 2, second 3, all the way down to however long it takes and then having to retract that thing. So the development process is really, really nice. Let me ask, just out of curiosity, I ask this question whenever I do a session with SharePoint 2013 that's around apps. I ask the same question, and so far I'm batting 100% on what the reaction is to this. Right? So I'm going to ask you 2 or 3 questions, right? And just be honest. First question is, how many of you consider yourselves very strong JavaScript developers? Okay, you can raise your hand, that's okay. You're sort of going, no, maybe, I don't know. I haven't seen your work, so we can't judge it. How many of you consider yourself like me, which is I've been doing JavaScript development for 10 years, but I've just been hacking my way through it, finding what somebody else has done on a site, pulling it over, put that script in, doesn't work, and I put a boatload of alerts in to figure it out. Anybody done that? Yeah, welcome to my world. That's what we've all done. I've hated JavaScript for the longest time. I saw the way it was going. I was a Silverlight guy. I finally gave up on my rounded corners, and I'm really working on the JavaScript stuff. There's a bunch of things that I think, bunch of tips and tricks that you want to pay attention to. AJAX, or asynchronous calls, really beat you up, so I'm going to show you some techniques around that, okay? And some of the debugging stuff that I'm using. All right? So, we won't be using any alerts for debugging. That's for sissies, so we're not going to do that. So let me just kind of show you. I was a sissy for 10 years, okay? So I'm backing on myself. Okay, so let me just give you a little tour of what this application looks like. And I know that the Solution Explorer is going to be a little small on the side, so I'll zoom in just a bit. But what I have here is the application has got a bunch of pieces to it, okay? So let me get rid of this guy. What you'll see down here is this is my scripts folder, and these are all the different libraries that I was referencing that I was using in the application, all right? Looks like a lot of JavaScript. Well, it doesn't just look like a lot of JavaScript. That is a lot of JavaScript. Now, keep in mind that you're only going to be using in production the ones that have that min or that don't have the debug name in them. Like, for example, if you look over here at Bootstrap, that's the one that is, all the JavaScript that you can look at and make it really human readable. The .min one is the minified one down to one line. All the white space is gone. They've renamed internal variables and all that stuff to make it really tiny, right? There's also a cool little trick here. If you look inside of my project, actually we'll go into, let me just do and that one. Inside of my project, you'll see this file here called optimizer.exe. And what that is that's going to allow me to take all the JavaScript and condense it down into a minified one file form if I want to deploy it that way. But that's just for the libraries, which I'm going to use everywhere. I only want to grab my JavaScript from my application asynchronously when I need it, a la SharePoint script on demand kind of thing. I'm not going to use script on demand. I'm going to use an open library called require.js. All right? So that's one thing I just wanted to point out there. So we can minify this. So don't get too queasy about all that stuff. All this stuff over here, all of these were added just with NuGet packages. All right? So I didn't write any of this stuff, so that's something we don't really have to look at. All right? The other thing about this project is I'm storing data in two different SharePoint lists. One's called a learning paths, and one's called learning items. All right? So learning paths, learning items has a lookup column back to learning paths to do a one-to-many relationship. Pretty straightforward stuff, right? I also have just a single, let's close that guy up so you see, because I know it's kind of hard to see at the bottom. I have a single ASPX page. He is my frame, he's the one loader that I have. Everything else is going to be a SPA, okay? So let's first take a look at that. Well, actually, let me just finish this off real quick. The rest of my code is all going to be underneath this app folder, but it's everything outside of the Durandal folder. Durandal adds that for you in this app, and then I've gone through and I've added in all of this other stuff for my application, for view models and views and entities and stuff like that. So now let's start kind of picking through this. But actually, instead of picking through it, why don't we take a second here to actually see it run in action. So I'm going to come over here and launch my site and go to my app that I've already deployed called Learning Path Manager, all right? So you saw it kind of transition in, all that kind of stuff. I'm not using anything from SharePoint except for the CSOM when I'm doing the workflow stuff at the very end. Everything else is non-SharePoint stuff, and it's really refreshing, right, to use all the open libraries. So what does this do? Well, I've got a couple different tabs here where I can look at different things. Remember, these are not images. These are icons. This is all fonts coming back and forth. I'll show you how we do that. I can jump back and forth between learning items, learning paths, learning items. You see that little animation popping up too. Once I've got the data from SharePoint, I'm not going back. My app is not going back to get additional data. It's caching it. And I don't have to deal with that. That's something that Durandal's doing for me. It's taking care of all that stuff for me. Once it's loaded the stuff it needs, it's done. Also got these cool little dialogues that pop up. This is part of Bootstrap, bringing these different dialogues in. So I can do that to bring stuff in. Come over here. I want to be able to add a new one, add a new learning path. So let's actually create a new learning path over here. New learning path. This would be to make it to Wednesday conference party tonight. So that's actually a learning path. It's going to be a tricky one we have to do, right? So come back over here, And it's not. Let's come back over. Did it save? There we go. So make it to Wednesday. I forgot to add one little thing to refresh the actual data once you've added an item. Kind of a dumb move, but I did it. I can edit this guy, or I could delete him if I wanted. I can also come back over here to learning items and then add new learning items, right? So different things you can read. Article, like don't, I'm already drinking apparently. Don't drink too much. Select a learning path. Make it to Wednesday, description, we'll add some stuff, URL, alcoholicsanonymous.com. Save, right? Don't drink too much. So there we go. You see these cool little notifications popping up too. That's a different library, and I'll show you how we're doing that in a second. And then finally, at the very end, we got this little workflow here to say, all right, time for everybody else to use it. I'll just click on this. It's going to go call the CSOM to start a workflow, and now it shows me that the workflow just started. And that is just a font. That's not even an image. That's pretty slick, all right? So how do we do it? All right, that's the gist of the app. It's pretty simple, but I'm going to show you all the stuff that I built for the thing. So first up is we want to look at the default.aspx page, all right? There's a boatload of stuff in this thing to show you. I'm not going to be able to show you absolutely everything in it. So I've got a bunch of stuff that I do want to make sure I highlight. So if I keep looking at notes, I'm actually just saying, don't forget to show this thing. So I'm not cheating. All right, so what is this doing? Well, one of the first things I'm doing here inside my default.aspx is I'm loading in, I've decided to take one of two approaches, and you can change this up for your application if you want. What I'm doing is I've decided that every JavaScript library and CSS file that I'm going to need, I've decided to load them on the front end, all right? So I've decided to add references to the SharePoint runtime for the client object model and the sp.js and the workflow services piece that's new inside SharePoint 2013. I've also decided to add in all of my CSS files, all of the JavaScript libraries. These are all the third-party things, these first two blocks. The last block at the bottom is just referencing my CSS file that I use for my application, stuff that's not part of these libraries, and one JavaScript library that is global to my entire application. It's basically my entity model, all right, for everything. Then we got to get the application started. So if I scroll down a little bit here, what you'll see is it's all going to boil down to this one little item here that is opening up. It's a JavaScript file that's calling this file called require.js, which is part of the asynchronous module definition, technique of loading things only when you need them. Right? And if it already has loaded them, it'll just pass the reference that it already has. Right? So that's the core thing. And I'm saying load require.js, and now I want you to go load everything in from main. So /app/main. So that's where our application's really going to start. And this is where I kind of enter into the Durandal world. All right? So what is all this stuff doing? What's the main.js? Well, at the top here, this is just one little required thing where it's requiring one module from, when I say module, think class. Think like a C# class or VB class if you haven't taken your C# pills yet. So it's one class that's going to go through and it's going to get loaded for the whole thing, right? And this is kind of a global thing. Once I have this, I don't need to do it again. There's this one called text. It's one of those things that you add it to your file and you're always going back to see everybody else adding it. You're like, why are you doing this? And you don't really care, but you just know you're supposed to do it, right? It's kind of like that using system at the very top of a C# file. Like, why do I add that? I don't really ever use anything core in system. Well, you do, but you get the picture. This next thing is I'm using this technique in JavaScript, this define thing, which is actually saying that I want to define a specific module, make sure that module is loaded. So what that's doing here is it's saying make sure that the require module has been loaded. Require is defined inside of require.js, which has already loaded because that's the thing that actually is loading main. So require.js is passing in through this define function a reference to itself. Okay? So let's just do this one time. Then I'm going to use this asynchronous module, this asynchronous pattern to say, here's some other modules and classes that I need inside of this specific module that I'm in. I need things like Durandal's system, app, this router, and the view locator. I need all of those different modules from my application. I need you to pull those things in. So what require does is he reaches out and goes, loads all those JavaScript libraries and gives me references to each one of them. If they're already loaded in memory, he doesn't re-download them. He just gives me an existing reference. And the last one is a logger service that I use. That's what's giving me a bunch of debug messages that I'll show you a little bit later on, and those toast messages as well. Durandal also gives me a way to say, turn on debugging across the thing. So give me a boatload of messages in the JavaScript console window. If I turn that off, they all go away. So that's something, obviously, you turn that off. It's kind of like the debug flag in a web config, right? You definitely don't want to go to production with that. And then I'm going to tell it, okay, well, we've gone through, we've loaded the app module. The app module has a method on it called start, which returns back this thing called a promise. A promise is a JavaScript thing. It's the way you should be doing asynchronous calls. I saw in Chris's stuff yesterday, in Chris O'Brien's session yesterday, he was using that pattern with the of promises using the then function and the done function. Basically, what you're doing is a JavaScript promise says, I'm going to go do something asynchronously, and when I'm done, I promise to come back to you. And you can say that once these things have completed, all of these deferred operations have completed, then do this. Or if you fail, do this. And then there's another technique you can do, which you can say, I want to run all of these asynchronous calls in parallel, and then once those are all finished, then go do something else. I show you that at the end when we get to the JavaScript, when we get to the workflow stuff. So this says, go start up the application, and then go do this other stuff. Now, the router use configuration and view locator use configuration, what those are doing is they're saying use the, convention. They're saying use these conventions that Durandal uses internally or expects you to use internally, which is you'll find all the view models in the view models folder where you underneath main. You'll find all the views in the views folder. You'll find this under this. There's actually some overrides on this use convention thing where I could have said, if I don't want to call it views, I could have called it view, singular. So I could have changed those up if I wanted to, and I just would have put in different parameters. All right? Next, I'm going to say, now to the router. What is the router? We're going to get into this in a second, but just file away of, oh, hey, look, if I don't get a valid route, then I need to tell the user that I don't know what that is. Right? So I'll show you where we do routes in a second. That's learning paths and learning items. Those are basically like two different pages or views. And then I say, go set the root of the application. So what's the root of the application? It's basically just taking over the entire section of the page that it's currently on, says, I want you to go load the module called shell, and I want you to use this transition called entrance. The transition entrance is how I was getting this really cool little, you'll see it kind of go, kind of slide in from the right. So it goes, kind of slides in, go to learning paths, slides in, go to learning paths, go to learning paths, slides in. The way I got that transition, it looks like complicated JavaScript, but all I did was just add a single thing here called entrance.js. There's a bunch of other additional transitions that Durandal supports. This is the one that it ships with. There's a knockout, there's a NuGet package for Durandal.transitions, and that's what it gives you as entrance. All right? So I'm going to go load the shell. All right, so let's go jump over to shell. So shell is in my view models. And what is this one doing? What this one's doing is using that same require statement. I don't have to use that text one anymore because he's already loaded, right? He's the one that loaded require. So the require.js, I'm using define, say I need to get references to a few things. Like, again, I need system, logger, router. Well, we already loaded those earlier, so they're not going to be re-downloaded. They just got the first time. And then I'm going to load this new module called config. Now, this other technique here that's going on is I basically, inside of this, think of this whole thing as a class, and the stuff that I want to make public in the class, I'm creating this object here called viewModel. He has a property or a method, they've treated basically the same thing in JavaScript, of activate and router. Those map to things inside this class as activate right here, and it also is going to expose the router, which you see is a module I'm defining up here. So my view model has two properties, activate and router. I'm then going to return that back to whoever loaded this thing up. Okay? Still with me? Okay. Now, what Durandal's going to do for me without me having to do a thing is he's going to always call that activate whenever the view model is completely loaded. So he's going to call the activate, and what activate's going to do is it simply just writes a little message to a little logger. This is the message that it writes. I can pass it some data. I'll show you I'm doing that a little bit later. I can do this to say, where is this log message coming from? You ever write a bunch of debug messages and you just write them through your app and you see them popping up and you're like, where the hell did that come from? I can't remember where I wrote that. And like, oh, that's right, I got to make sure I reference the method in the class and all that kind of stuff. This guy's like, I'll do that for you, don't worry. This last property here says, does this need to be on the, do I show this as a toast message, or I'm going to write it to the console, but do I also show as a toast message, right? So true or false. In this case, I don't really need to say that. Finally, I'm going to say, let's go configure all of our routes, and then let's return back a promise to whoever called us, because the activate method is actually going to generate a promise for us under the covers. So it says, I'm going to give you back this thing called a promise, right? So what is this config routes? This is where I'm kind of defining my navigation. So underneath config, what I'm doing here is I'm setting some global variables, like my toasts, I want them to show up in the top right corner. That's a CSS class. A couple of them are shipped inside the toaster library. And I say I only want it to show up for about 2 seconds. Obviously, I can drop that down to 1 second or half a second if I want very easily. I'm then going to go create an array of routes. And these routes, there's 2 of them. One's called learning paths, and one's called learning items. They have, if you set these specific properties, like the URL, the module ID, and the visibility of them, then the routing framework is going to be able to figure out what route you're on and what view model goes with that route, and it'll automatically load it for you, right? So I'm going to take these routes that I've created, and I'm going to return them back to whoever just created, whoever instantiated this config object, this config class or module. And I'm also going to tell it what the start module is. So looking back at shell.js, you see that he now knows what all the different routes are. He's mapped all of them. You can manually map each one. There's like a map to and a map nav and a map URL, or you can just create an array and give it everything at once. I like doing it like this because now I've got one place where my navigation is kind of defined, right? And then I say, which one am I supposed to activate? Go activate the learning paths one, because that's the one that was in that property, okay? So now you're wondering, like, oh, a lot of JavaScript. I'm still not seeing anything. How are things loading? Well, if I jump back to main, remember main's the one that loaded the shell. What main did is he first loaded the view model called shell, and then he knows that shell also has a corresponding view. So he's going to take shell, and he's going to load shell.html inside of the main application. All right? Let me break up some lines here to make it a little bit easier to read. There we go. So what's going on here? Well, first thing I want to show you is a little bit of knockout stuff on the far right-hand side. So in here on this div, you'll see that I have a data bind attribute. That data bind attribute is Knockout's leveraging the bind piece to saying, I want to bind a CSS property called active, or actually it's a CSS class called active. I want that to be added to this element or removed from this element based on the property whatever router.is navigating, right? This is my little spinner saying we're navigating from one view to the next, and it always is navigating until the entire view model has loaded for the next thing that we're getting. So the thing will spin until it's loaded the view model, and that way I can get data on the fly and everything before I actually show my view. The next thing there is you see that I tag. This is font awesome. I'm using the I tag and I'm putting a class in there that says icon spinner. That's just the static image of that thing, the spinner that I had showing an animation. I then said I want it to be twice as big, icon-2x, and then I want it to move, icon-spin. That's all I had to do to get that little icon to show up and spin, right? How many of you, I should know this answer already. How many of you are not developers in the room? 1, 2 or 3, okay. Of all of you, yeah, this might apply to everyone then. So mainly for the developers though. How many of you spend way too much freaking time getting that one little icon to work the way you want it to work? Building all the database stuff, all the services stuff and everything, that stuff, I can get through that, I'm just fine. And then you're just churning, like going, damn that pixel, right? You can't figure it out. Forget that, man. Font awesome, tons of fonts, it's all free, cool library, you add it in there. Those are CSS classes that it's already defined. The next thing that I did here down in the navigation is I'm using Bootstrap. Bootstrap has a thing called a navigation. I told it that I wanted to use pills, and it's just basically going to go through and do my navigation. It could do blocks, it could do buttons, it could do whatever. I said use pills. The pills look like, I guess it would be nice if I just left the app running. These are the pills, and it has an active state and a deactive state right here. So this is where we are in my app, is this part of the navigation. it asked, well, I don't know how many should I do here. Well, I said, well, I want you, using knockout, data bind, for each router, look at all the visible routes. So it looked at that array that I passed it, filtered out all the ones where visible was equal to false, grabbed all the ones that were true, enumerated through all of them, and is creating a LI tag, a list item tag, for each one of them. He's setting the active property, writing a new class to it called is. He's writing a new class, a CSS class called active that I've defined in my CSS, just the visibility is true or display or none, based on the view model that has a property called isActive, right? The view model, the thing that I'm on, is the navigation, the route of the navigation. If it's true, if it's shown, it'll show that. And then finally, a little bit farther down on the anchor tag, I'm going to say I want to then go make it just a hyperlink that we're using here. Make the href of the attribute href for the anchor tag equal to the hash, which is whatever the URL is that Durandal's using to get to that specific path. So in my case, it would be whatever the URL of the site is. So default.aspx pound or /pound/ learning items or learning paths, right? And then it goes on a little bit farther to say. Okay, so then we got a new thing here that I want to show you, and then we can start digging into actually the application, getting data and stuff. This piece right here, this section of content where you see this weird little HTML fragment here, what this is this is going to be the core of where my application is going to live. This is where the lists and all the buttons and everything are. All right? What I've done is I've created this section, and I'm using a syntax in Knockout to say I want you to compose a UI. Now, what the compose thing does, Durandal's leveraging this as well, is he's saying, I'm going to pass you in a model, and that model is going to be whatever the active item is. The active item that's being passed in, remember, that's part of the route, and that's telling it what view model does he map to. So if I'm on learning paths, go to viewModel/learningpaths.js. That's my view model. He's going to load that JavaScript file. Once he loads that JavaScript file, he's then going to go load the HTML file for me. That's the learningpaths.html in the views folder. Once he's done both of those things, he's going to call a function called afterCompose, router.afterCompose. This basically says, let me know when you're done so that I can get a callback that I can hook into to do some stuff after the UI is finished building. Okay? So I can do stuff before it loads and after it loads. And then finally, I'm setting a transition to entrance to get that cool little slide in. So this section right here is really the crux of the entire application. This is the one that's switching in different views based on what I'm clicking on. The navigation that I'm clicking on is changing the thing that's what the current active route is, which this is going to be responding to based on looking at all this observable stuff. Make sense? Still with me? Yes, sir.
So what you've got commented out in there, is that going to get injected by another module?
Nope, that's going to be. So Durandal is leveraging Knockout's compose functionality to go through and to look at these things to figure out what module should he load right here. So Durandal and Knockout together right now are the ones that are going to be loading this UI for me right here. There's nothing else that's going to be loading the UI. That's doing all of it.
So even though it's commented out, it will still.
It's going to run. Yeah, because Durandal's looking for that. This is actually this is actually a Knockout tag. Right. When you're doing like this, Knockout leverages the HTML kind of comments and stuff to do that stuff. I know that tripped me up too for a bit. No, it's not commented. It is commented out, but it works.
You know what? That makes a lot of sense.
You've never seen functional comments, have you? No. There you go. Here's another one down here. I have a debug module that I'm adding at the very bottom so that I click it, it shows up, I can get to my lists and stuff like that really easily. Yeah, Paul.
So router is scoped globally?
Router is scoped globally because router is exposed right here as shell and is returned back to main.
So is everything scoped globally?
No. I decide what I want to be scoped globally. Right now, the only thing that is scoped globally is router is the only thing that's scoped globally. Anything that I've defined inside of core.js, because that's the one I loaded on the default.aspx page, that's also scoped globally. Everything else, I decide what I want to expose to mark internals and all that kind of stuff. Okay? All right, so that shell in, wake up. Okay, that shell. Now, we've seen now that under shell, how shell is going to be loading. Now we know how we're getting learning paths, right? Everybody with me? We know how we're getting to the learning path of the home page. Now let's see what happens when it says the home page is loading. That's all the framework stuff of first loading up. what it's doing is it's loading in the view model called learning paths. All right, so there's a boatload of stuff going on here. We're going to look at some of it. All right, so what this is doing is I'm first going in. I'm getting references to a bunch of things I'm going to need access to. And then down here, I'm creating, these essentially are going to equate to internal fields or internal functions. For those of you who haven't used Knockout, one of the things that Knockout does is, like I said, it allows me to update objects in JavaScript, and as I update them, Knockout will just go fix up the UI based on those things changing. It's listening for those changing. If you did anything with like MVVM and like XAML languages, it's kind of their implementation of the iData notification or I notification changed. iData notification changed. You guys know what I'm trying to say, please. I can't remember the interface. So I've got things like just observables. I have observable collections. And I also have computeds, which are basically a function that says, hey, when you call this property, I'm actually going to go figure out what the stuff is, right? So that's not observable. It's just a computed that says I can kind of pull stuff together for you. So these are all private things. They're not exposed unless I put them in the core view model and then return those back to people. So this is not scoped globally, to your question, Paul. These things are not scoped globally. They're scoped inside the shell. Only the shell can access these things. So another module couldn't access this stuff unless he required this module, and then he can access these different pieces. Any other functions that are listed, and these different things, that's the property and that's the function it maps to. So there's actually a function inside of this model, this view model, that shows, that maps to it. So like under, where is it? We have one called refresh, and we have one called activate. If I come down to refresh, you'll see right here, refresh is this function here, which is going to call a function called load learning paths, and that one I don't expose to the public signature of this object, okay? So under activate, what's he doing? He's checking to see if he's got data. If he does have data, then I don't do anything. That's basically if I navigate from the list items view back over to learning paths. Well, I'd already been to learning paths, so I had already initialized them, so why go get the data again, right? I only want to go get the data if someone actually clicks refresh. Obviously, it's just business logic, so if you want it to work differently, you can see how easy it would be to change it. Now I need to go get the data. This is using some of the idea of a promise. Now, I have intentionally not done this app fully with promises in some places, and I have in other places, okay? So if you go get this code and you go run it, you might notice some weird kind of like loading times. And what I'm trying to show you is the downside to not using this when you're making multiple asynchronous calls, all right? So it may look weird at one or two times, and it's not working, and that's intentional, right? So I made the bug. That was an intentional bug. We call those features, or at least that's what the product team calls them at SharePoint. So down here, I'm going to say, go use this thing called a data service to go get all my data. I have a function in there, public function on my data service called get unpublished learning paths. I got this data service object because up here at the very top, I said, go load it on demand, okay? So all my data access is going to be in that guy. So he's going to go load the data. He should return back a promise. This is the part that said he will not return back a promise, but he's expecting to return one. So I say after I get the data, go then do this stuff and then do this stuff here. So I'm nesting different asynchronous calls, but you'll see when we get in here, I'm not actually using promises. So the timing of things can get out of whack, right? So even though I'm using it here, because I didn't do it under the covers, it's not really, it doesn't count, all right? Let's see. So the next thing I want to show you is, let me show you then, after I load the learning paths here, if you remember, or let's see, where do I want to show? Go back up here. I want to show you the view. You see I have published learning paths, published live learning paths, those are the ones that live up in Azure, and unpublished learning paths, all right? So let me show you where those things are going to be manifested in the view, and then we'll go back and look and see how we actually got that data. So if we come over here and look at my view called learningpaths.html, you'll see here at the top, what I have is another one of those knockout composed bindings, and all that does is that's building up my navigation at the top of my application. It's building up that nav inside of this view so that I don't have to recopy this HTML fragment all over the place. So all that's doing is going and finding the view called nav.html and loading it. It's not loading a view model because it looks for a view model first, notices it's not there, so he just says, all right, well, I'm just going to go straight to the view then. and nav is just static HTML, okay? So I'll let you look at that if you want to on your time. The next thing here is I want to create this tabbed interface. So what that is that's when you're looking at the learning paths, now we're looking at this piece right here. The nav piece was everything like right on this line right here, including those two buttons. Then I come over here and I got my learning paths, all right? So I've got this tabbed interface. So if I come over here and look at my tabbed interface, you can see again, just using knockout stuff, I'm saying go loop through, the tabbed interface is implemented right here with this div. It's tabbable. I put the tabs on the left. This is coming from Bootstrap. These are Bootstrap classes. I'm not writing these. Bootstrap's letting me set up a navigation. How does it do a tabbed interface? It wants a navigation on the left-hand side. You just call it nav tabs. It has classes like pull right, pull left to right align stuff or left align stuff, like the text align things. Again, I'm using Font Awesome to show that things coming from Azure are in the cloud, or they just have these little blank circles on them. It knows, have this data toggle tab. This is part of the spec inside of Bootstrap that says, here's how it knows what's a tab and what isn't, so I know how to go through and add the styles and stuff that need to be there. And then I've got 3 things of content. I have tab content, and I have 3 tabs that contain content. So we'll just look at the unpublished one. This one is the one that starts out as active. If I take active off and put another one on there, then it will show you how the UI, and it's kind of hard, well, yes, you guys can kind of see it, where the UI, like this is white and this has got a gray background. See how that's kind of white bleeding into this, and white bleeding in? That's what that class is doing. And then I'm using another Font Awesome thing, another Bootstrap thing to say, make my table have alternating colored rows. God, how many times have we done that? It's a pain to figure out the CSS for that, right? This one says, don't worry, I'll take care of it. Make it a striped table. Like, oh, okay, cool, thanks. And then let's just enumerate through the collection, the public collection on the current view model, which is learning paths. He had a property that we exposed called unpublished learning paths. Enumerate through everything in that collection, build up a new table row for each one, and on each one, I want you to have one div or one cell that we're going to call actions. This is my class. I'm going to create this thing from Bootstrap called button group. It's a button. It's a tiny button. Force refresh. When you click on it, I want you to go to the view model, the root view model. So this is a knockout technique where right now the current data context of the item we're on is a learning path. But the learning path is just an entity. The learning paths view model, the big view model, has got a function called edit command. So I need to go from the data context up one level to the context, but I know the root of my context right now is actually the view model, so I just said root. There's also a parent, or there's a parent collection that you can pass in an index to jump all the way back if you want, or different places. And then I'm adding a little pencil icon for the edit one and the delete. So that's how I'm getting these guys right here to show up, okay? And then again, at the bottom here, you will come back at the very end of the session, and I'll show you how we're doing workflow as well. So when someone clicks on this edit button, it's going to go fire up the edit command. So let me show you that. Let's jump back over here to learning paths. And what that does under edit command, there you go, edit command right here. I'm using the same kind of syntax that we use in XAML stuff where we have the command infrastructure and not using like the eventing model. So I'm using that same pattern. It's not a pattern in JavaScript. It's my pattern that I'm implementing. I'm using the same grammar and stuff. So it's intuitive to people who are coming from MVVM. So what I'm doing here is I'm first going to log a message. I'm then going to say, let's set the current learning path. So I have a variable inside of my view model called current learning path. It is a knockout observable. The way you set the value of a knockout observable is you pass what to set it, you pass it in as a function. So current learning path on line 236 is a property, but I'm setting its value by calling it as a function. That's what knockout's doing. Then I have this whole modal dialog that's popping up, and that's the one that you saw sliding in and stuff. I'm running a little bit out of time to show you that dialog, but basically all it is just an HTML fragment. I'm going through and I'm changing different values in it to make it, if it's either new, edit, or delete confirmation. So things like if it's on edit, then set the title of it to learning path, clear out the subheader. The subheader is used on the delete to say, are you sure you want to delete this? The input tags, if it's a delete, it added the read-only attribute. Otherwise, I'm going to remove that from all the input tags, all the form fields. Then the confirm button, well, I need to change that up because if it's a new or an edit, then I want to have save and I want it to be blue. So I'm going to get rid of the entire CSS class attribute from this object, from that button, and then I'm going to add back the button and button primary. Button says it's a bootstrap button, and button primary says make it blue, right? If I don't make it blue, it just is gray. That's what the cancel button was. And then I'm changing the label on the button to save. The delete one changes this up to say, it does the same thing here, but it adds the read-only attribute, and it says button dash, I think, remove. It's down here, a little bit farther down. Then what I'm setting is I'm saying, go reset the state of the dialog, go reset the state of it, which is changing all the values inside of it, and then finally, is it in edit mode, okay? Actually, I didn't need to do either one of those things. Now that I look at it, I realize that I actually did that up here. I meant to, this is the start of a refactoring to put that in a function. So my bad. The last part, go show the dialog, right? So that shows the dialog, and then inside the dialog, I have a function. Remember, I'm still on the same page, so when I'm inside the dialog and I click save, he's going to call save a learning path, which is then going to go up here, add a learning path. So now, let's jump down to edit because that's where we were. We were looking at the update. He's going to say, go do some validation, make sure you put some stuff in. Once you did, I'm then going to hide the dialog, save the learning path, and then I'm going to go in and refresh the screen of all the different pieces. If you succeed, go log that it succeeded with the toast message. That's a little green box that popped up, or a blue box that popped up. So let me show you some of the data access stuff on how we're getting the data and how we're writing the data back. If I look at data access, is under services or data services. Let's first see how we're getting all the data. So there's the public signature I'm making for this data service. All right. So these are all the things for learning paths. There's learning items. Take note of this. I'm creating a deferred. A deferred object is the basis of a promise, of a jQuery promise or JavaScript promise. The deferred object is something that jQuery will create it helps you with and can create for you. So I'm saying go create a deferred object, right? You might want to go advanced and create multiple ones so I could add multiple promises so something else could wait for a lot of things to happen. In this case, it just said we're only going to have one at a time. We're keeping it simple. So when the app loaded, remember, I said go get the learning paths. So what am I doing? This is just REST. This is just REST, all right, using SharePoint lists. So I'm passing in a collection. That was the knockout observable array of learning paths from the view model. I passed that in. So the first thing I'm doing is go flush it. Get everything out of there. Set it to nothing. Then go create a query. I've got this other module that I've created here called SPAppUtils so that I don't have to keep writing my URLs for everything all the time. And I'm using that thing that we have on every SharePoint page called SPPageContextInfo, which will tell me things like what's the absolute URL, what's the server relative URL, and then I also have another function here to build up the API for the REST call if I want. Where is, I lost my data service. So here, that's getting the basis of the URL. Then I'm just simply using standard REST. Go get go to the list called learning paths, get all the items, select just the ID, the title, the published state, keywords, and this is a fun one. Underscore the comments field doesn't come back to you as comments. If you look inside the actual field definition inside a site column for comments, it's underscore comments. But it can't start with an underscore with OData. So SharePoint throws on OData underscore and then finishes it off with underscore comments. I was sitting there for like forever just beating my head against the wall. What the hell's going on? And finally popped open the debugging tools and was going, oh, that's what's going on. It's coming back as something totally different. And unlike every other thing, every other language, JavaScript says you're referencing something that doesn't exist. So sometimes I'll tell you it's undefined and sometimes I just won't tell you anything. So you're like, no, break. It wouldn't break, so. Then down here, this is where I'm telling you I'm doing promises the wrong way. I'm making my AJAX call right here, and then this piece right here should be, this is the AJAX call to go make that request. This OData utils, this, man, if you're doing REST stuff with SharePoint, this will save you so much. I've used this not even in a single page app, but I use this in so much stuff. Create a template for all the different kinds of calls that you can make. Create a get template right here where you can specify what your payload is if you need to submit something and where you're going. There's my endpoint, and there's my payload. Well, I'm not going to pass in a payload for a get, which is the one up at the very top. So I'm not even using a payload. So the base request, that's the thing I defined up earlier, it just said it's got a type and a URL property. So it's going to be a get request. There's the URL I'm going to. We crafted that a minute ago and just handed it to this guy to go build it up. And then I'm going to set all the headers, which is the one header you have to have on gets using the SharePoint REST. Okay? The next thing I have is a new. So you can see I'm adding in the additional stuff, like saying I need a post. It's a setting the content type, and I'm also setting the X request digest to _ request, where we can get the request digest. If you were in Eric Shupp's session earlier today, he talked about how you needed that. And then down here, I'm doing the update. At the very bottom, you can see, on the delete here, on the delete and on the update, I'm using that merge. Eric talked about this. If you just use a put or a post for an update, then it will update all the things that you specify, and everything you don't specify, it nulls them out. You're like, well, I didn't want to do that. I just want to change some things. So to get around that, you add in an XHP method of merge, and it says, okay, I'll only change the things you tell me to change. I'll leave everything else. What eTag does is everything in SharePoint has an eTag. Translation, everything's got a version number. If I try to update an item and I tell it match the eTag of 1, but someone else has already come behind me and updated it to 2, the service kicks back and says, failed on a match on the eTag. You've seen the error before which says the page is out of shape. Not out of shape. The page is old. You need to refresh the page because you're making a conflicting change. You've seen that on all these different kinds of web apps. That's what's going on. They're looking at it saying, sorry, you're trying to update something that has already been updated from when you last looked at it. You need to update your view and make sure that your changes are cool. The other thing, Eric said something this morning, or I guess it was this afternoon, or I don't know when it was. I'm lost. And I'm sitting next to Paul up there, and Eric says, yeah, it's cool because when you're doing these updates, you need to request digest, and these things are good for 30 minutes. So if you're doing anything with REST and the request digest is longer than 30 minutes, you're doing something wrong. I'm like, no, someone might be using my app for 30 minutes, and the request digest might actually die on me. So he's right, but keep in mind that this value is only good for 30 minutes. So you might want to periodically not use this guy. It might be better to go fetch it using a post to the HTTP page context to get that the request digest from there instead of using the page. Yeah, Ben.
You can also use there's a REST call.
That's the REST call is the page context. So I think it's context info or page context info, something like that. So just keep that in mind. I'm not doing that here because this is demo code and I'm not selling this. If you want this, you can pay me and I'll fix it. I'm just kidding. Not really. I'm kind of serious. But I got business cards if you want to talk later. Okay, so let's see. The other thing I wanted to show you, that was the post. There's other things in here about doing the updates and the deletes. And then farther down, you'll see at the very bottom of this guy, I also have this thing about building the payloads. So when you want to go build the object that you want to send, that you need to submit, like on a new, an update, or a delete, there's one up there at the top, which is the learning. Let's look at the learning paths because we're not really focusing on learning items. So in the learning paths here, what this guy is, I'm creating a payload object, and I'm setting him. He's got __ metadata. You saw this in Eric's session today. The type is equal to whatever type that SharePoint's telling you the type is. You get that by doing one REST call on that list and seeing what it tells you. Setting the title, setting the OData comments field, which is really _comments, and setting the publish state, then using jQuery to say JSON.stringify this thing as a real string, and then that's when I'm going to send across. I don't have to worry about any of that D : blah stuff, or any of the curly brackets or that kind of stuff. Well, I guess I got some curly brackets. But I don't have to worry about building the string itself. I build an object, I tell jQuery to stringify it, I'm good. Okay, there's a lot more stuff to show in this thing. Have you guys found this interesting? There's one more thing I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the workflow stuff because it's really slick, and the code samples in MSDN don't work. Shocker. Well, you can always tell this stuff doesn't work on MSDN or TechNet, especially for SharePoint, because just look at the date it was published. Almost all of them were published in July of 2012. Hey, that's when the public beta shipped. Things have changed. So just look at the date of this stuff. The one thing that if you guys find this interesting, if you think that other people would find this interesting, I'm thinking about doing like a blog series on this, cleaning this guy up, and then doing like a multi-part series, writing this stuff up. You guys think that'd be a good idea? Or? Okay, that's positive feedback. All right, let me show you the last thing here to wrap up in the last like 2 or 3 minutes. As you see, there's a boatload of stuff. The list items thing, it's got a lot of stuff in it as well. The data access for list item is showing you things like, let's see, what do I want to show you? Oh, Eric touched on this as well, but right here when you're doing the requests, there's a lookup field from the learning items back to learning paths. I'd like to find out which one it's in because in my UI, notice that when I'm in the learning items, some of these are locked. That's because they're published. They're part of a learning path that's been published. So there's in this view, part of the knockout binding I've set is to either do these buttons or these buttons based on the current list, the current learning item's property of is published or not, right? Because I don't want you changing stuff if it's published up in the cloud, right? So what this is doing is you have to use this thing called expand. It's one of the grammar options that we have inside of the OData language. And then further, it's, you have to also make sure that it's included on your select statement, okay? That can be a bit tricky. Okay, the last thing that I want to touch on here is just the workflow stuff. This is pretty cool, and this is the way you should be doing promises. So I have another command down here, and right here, where it's called start workflow, start publish workflow command. And that was bound to the button in my view. Let me find that view real quick. Where's my learning paths? Nope, that's the learning paths. So here you go right here. Under, if it's not published, sorry, where is it? Yeah, so if the workflow is currently not publishing, then I want you to show that that icon that showed the 2 arrows going like crossed on us. These guys. And if when I click this, it's going to change the property to is published, and which is going to write out the little spinner again. So I'm choosing one of 2 options, and seeing all I'm going to do in my code is I'm just going to change the state of this value, and knockout is going to switch between those 2 divs, right? You just express what you want it to do and let knockout do the work. That's why I love knockout, right? All right, so in the view model there that we were just looking at, don't get too many files open. I'm going to come over here and say, go start this workflow. Go start a workflow on this item. And all I'm passing in is the ID of the item. I'm returning back a promise. So when I call this function right here, it better say, yes, when you're done, I will go in and specify that the workflow is currently publishing. That's what changed the icon. So when you go to start it, don't change the icon until you really start it. All right? So let's go look at the workflow CSOM. Again, the code samples for this on MSDN are not correct. There's a bunch of workflow stuff coming out on MSDN that I'm working on for them. So, all right, so we got some global variables and stuff like that, but that all exposed is one method called start workflow. Oops, starting to go over, so let me wrap this up real fast. A couple things we do when we want to go do workflow, start a workflow on a list item. You need to start the workflow. It's all going to boil down to this one call. Go to the workflow instance service, call start workflow on a list item. I need to give it the workflow subscription, AKA we used to call this an association. So what workflow am I starting on this list? Second piece, what's the ID of the list item that we're going to start it on? Part 3, remember how we can use initiation forms and stuff? Do I need to pass any values into it from an initiation form? No, I just need to pass in a null, pass in an empty collection. Don't put null here, it won't start. You'll get an error back from workflow. Workflow is kind of nice. It'll actually tell you what the problem is. It's very, I think that's because the SharePoint team didn't write the workflow stuff this time around. I don't think I said, that wasn't out loud. That was my inside voice. You guys are just making noise inside my head on how you did that. Okay, here we go. Look. So right here, start the publish workflow. So here it is. Start it. So what am I going to do? This is how you do promises. I'm going to return. You always want, when you're using promises, always return one back. So first, go connect to SharePoint. That's a function that's running in a second. I'll show you in a second what it's doing. It's basically creating and initializing the client context, the workflow services manager, the workflow deployment service. This is the core hub for workflows, kind of like workflow context. Here's SharePoint context. Here's workflow context. Here is the service that's going to give me a list of all of the workflow definitions that have been deployed to this site collection. Here's the subscription service, or here's what I'm going to use to go find out what the associations are on lists and on sites. Here's the instance service I'm going to use to go look and enumerate through all the instances or start them. We'll look at that function at the end. But it says when you get those back, you're going to hand back all these different things and go set those to my local variables. Once you've done that, then I want you to go run this code. Now the next step is I need to get the definition, the workflow that was actually created, and the association. I need to get the ID of the list that we're working on, and I need to get the workflow definition, because I'll use both of those to go find out the subscription, right? So I can enumerate through the subscriptions and say, what workflows are associated with you? Oh, I got these 5. Okay, let me look at each 5 of them. Which one on that list with this ID matches this workflow definition GUID? I'm going to do these 2 calls, which return promises. I don't care which one I do first. I don't care one shouldn't wait on the other one. They're totally independent calls. So what I'm going to say is both these guys return promises. When you guys are done, pass in your results to this next callback, grab the learning path selected and the definition, and now go find the subscription. And when you're done, you've got the subscription GUID, go start it by passing the subscription with this ID. Did you follow that? No. Well, you can get the code and I'm out of time. So I'm going to show you the last function. Last function right here is here's how you do promises. Let me find a small method. Small method right here. I'm creating my deferred object right here. I'm going to go do a asynchronous call, get execute query async, and inside of the succeed callback, I'm going to say when you resolve the promise, which means it succeeded, here's what you do when things are good, I'm going to hand back this thing called the get ID from the learning path list. That was the variable that was being passed up on that in the earlier when I was passing back different things. Like remember when I said I passed back all the things that I initialized, like the context service manager, deployment service, subscription instance. I said resolve and then pass them all back. But if things failed on the fail callback, you're going to reject the promise with these arguments, and then I'm going to return back on my deferred object. I'll return the promise back where I can use it in different ways, either with when dones or with then fails. Okay? Code for all this. This is showing you how to start a workflow then when all you know is the name of the workflow and the ID of the list item. Okay? So obviously there's a boatload of stuff in here. I hope that I kind of at least whet your palate, or whet your appetite. This looks somewhat interesting to you. The JavaScript stuff is not that bad. The debugging stuff is really not that bad. I didn't have time to show that today. If anybody wants to see that while Ben's setting up, I'll pull this off on the side and I can show you guys that stuff. But I really appreciate you guys sticking around. Did you guys get something out of this? Did you like it? Yeah. Does it look interesting to do? I mean, instead of, you know what the cool?
It's different.
It's very different. All of that stuff you see, and I'm dead honest when I say this, all the stuff that you see, that was only 25 hours of work. And that is all the learning, the ramp up time and all of that stuff. You want to learn more about single page apps, John Papa is a guy named John Papa, exactly how it sounds, JOHNPAPA. JohnPapa.net, he's like the big guy behind this stuff right now, doing a lot of this. He's got a great course on Pluralsight, Jumpstart. I learned a lot of stuff from him. When you actually look at his, you're like, Andrew looks like, a lot of his stuff looks like what John did, right? And there's no coincidence there, but we're both using the same libraries like Bootstraps. That's why things do look a little bit similar. But it's pretty cool. It was pretty nice to be able to get ramped up on that and to be able to do this as quick as it was. Okay? Cool. Thank you very much, guys.